The screaming starts before the sun goes down. Not gunshots, not sirens, screaming. In the Bronx, that sound usually means trouble, but this time, it means something worse. Because people aren't just disappearing, they're being erased. Miguel Martinez knows his block like he knows his own heartbeat. The corner bodega, the graffiti-tagged benches, the old tenants who've lived there forever. Except lately, forever has been ending. One by one, neighbors vanish after signing papers with a smiling real estate company nobody's ever heard of. And here's the thing. Miguel notices what adults ignore. The movers only come at night. The new tenants never step outside during the day. Windows stay blacked out. No reflections in the glass. Then Luis goes missing. And Miguel realizes this isn't gentrification. It's hunting. Miguel doesn't tell the cops. Cops don't care about kids from his block unless they're in trouble. Instead, he calls an emergency meeting. Him, Bobby, and Luis's little brother Sid crammed into the back of the bodega between shelves of canned beans and plantain chips. The air smells like fried food and worry. Miguel lays it out. Luis followed the real estate guys last night. Black suits, pale faces, and he never came home. Bobby tries to laugh it off. Bro, you think they're, what, vampires? Miguel doesn't laugh, because he saw something. One of the men stepped into the streetlight, and there was nothing in the mirror of a parked car. No reflection, just empty glass. Silence. Silence. Sid's hands shake. His brother is out there somewhere. So, they do what kids do best. They investigate. That night, they sneak into the abandoned apartment building on 113rd. The hallway smells wrong. Metallic. Sweet. Like pennies soaked in sugar. Miguel's chest tightens. Doors hang open. Furniture covered in plastic. And on the wall, huge crates stamped with the same company logo buying up their neighborhood. Bobby whispers, "This is crazy. We should leave." But then they hear it. A thud. Soft. Weak. From behind a locked basement door, Miguel grips the handle. This is a mistake, he knows it, but if Luis is down there, the door creaks open, and something moves in the dark. The basement light flickers once, twice, then dies. Darkness swallows them whole. Miguel hears breathing, not theirs. Slow. Wet. Close. Sid grips his sleeve so tight it hurts. Bobby fumbles with his phone flashlight, and the beam cuts through the black like a blade. Luis is there, strapped to a chair. His head hangs forward, skin pale, lips cracked. 2 small puncture marks stain the collar of his shirt. He's alive. Barely. Miguel rushes to him, shaking his shoulders. "Luis, wake up!" "Come on." Luis's eyes flutter open, unfocused. "They're not people," he whispers. A sound echoes behind them. Clap. Slow. Deliberate. A tall figure steps into the edge of the flashlight beam. Perfect suit. Skin smooth and gray like marble. Eyes too still. "Children shouldn't sneak into private property," the man says, voice calm, amused. Miguel feels it then. The wrongness. Miguel feels it then. The wrongness. No breath fogging the cold air. No blink. No reflection in the metal pipes behind him. Vampire. The man tilts his head. "Your neighborhood is ripe. Strong blood. Generations of it." He smiles, revealing just a hint of fang. "We're simply renovating." Rage floods Miguel's chest. This isn't about buildings, it's about his people, his block, his family. The vampire moves fast, too fast. 1 second across the room, the next, right in front of Bobby. Sid screams. Miguel grabs the nearest thing he can find, a broken mop handle, and swings. Crack. The wood splinters against the creature's shoulder. The vampire recoils, more surprised than hurt. Smoke rises where the wood touched skin. Wood. It burns them. The vampire's expression shifts. No more amusement. Now it's hunger. And they are very, very close. The vampire lunges. Miguel shoves Bobby aside just as the creature's hand slices through the air where his throat was a second ago. Sid drops to his knees, scrambling for anything wooden chair leg, broomstick, anything. Luis groans, barely conscious, tied to the chair like he's already halfway to a coffin. "Run!" Bobby yells. But Miguel doesn't. He can't. He can't. He can't. This is his block. His friend. His fight. The vampire's face shifts, veins spidering under gray skin, eyes flooding black. Fangs drop fully now. No pretending, no suits, just predator. It grabs Miguel by the collar and lifts him like he weighs nothing. The room tilts. Air vanishes from his lungs. "I'm dead." This is how it ends. Then Sid swings. A broken chair leg cracks against the vampire's skull. Smoke hisses. The creature shrieks, high, animal, furious, and drops Miguel. Bobby doesn't waste the moment. He tackles the basement light switch panel, ripping exposed wires free. Sparks explode. The vampire recoils again, hissing at the sudden flare. Light. Wood. Weaknesses. Miguel coughs, dragging Luis's chair toward the stairs. "Help me," he shouts. Together they haul him up step by step, the vampire recovering fast behind them. Its voice echoes up the stairwell, smooth again, controlled. "You can't save everyone." Those words hit harder than claws. They burst onto the street just as the creature reaches the top step, but it stops at the doorway. Smoke curls from its skin where moonlight touches. It watches them, smiling. "You'll come back," it says softly. "They always do." The door shuts. Sirens wail somewhere distant, but not for them. Never for them. Miguel kneels beside Luis on the sidewalk. Pale, weak, alive. This isn't random. This is organized, planned, systematic. They're not just feeding, they're taking over. And Miguel realizes something worse. There wasn't just one vampire down there. There were crates. Rows of them. Miguel doesn't sleep that night. None of them do. They hide Luis in the back of the bodega while his mom thinks he's at a cousin's place. The kid's skin looks thinner somehow, like something drained more than blood. Every time headlights sweep past the window, Sid flinches. Bobby paces. And Miguel stares at the real estate flyer taped outside across the street. For sale. Luxury living. Coming soon. Luxury for who? By morning, 3 more buildings have sold signs. Old Mrs. Rivera is packing boxes. She says the buyers paid in cash. Too much cash. "Nice young men," she calls them. Miguel feels heat crawl up his neck. Nice doesn't leave bite marks. Luis finally wakes fully. His voice is sandpaper. "They're building something," he whispers. Basements connected. Tunnels. His hands tremble. "I heard them talking. A master coming. Something older. Older." Miguel's stomach drops. This isn't a random nest. It's a takeover. So he does something crazy. He goes public. That afternoon, he stands on a milk crate outside the bodega and tells the block everything. Vampires. Basements. Crates. People laugh at first. Then they see Luis's neck. The color drains from their faces. Fear spreads fast. But fear alone won't save them. That night, lights go out across 3 buildings at once. Not a blackout. A message. And in the darkness, moving shadows begin knocking on doors. The first scream comes from Mrs. Rivera's building. Not loud. Not dramatic. Cut off. Miguel is already running before his brain catches up. Bobby beside him. Sid clutching a backpack stuffed with broken broom handles, kitchen knives taped to sticks, anything wooden they could find. The streetlights flicker like they're scared too. Doors hang open. Inside, the hallway smells like that same metallic sweetness. Miguel's chest tightens. Too late. We're too late. A shadow detaches from the ceiling. It drops. Bobby swings first, splintered back cracking against pale ribs. Smoke bursts. The vampire snarls. But this one isn't dressed in a suit. No polish, no patience, just hunger. Its claws rake Bobby's arm. Blood sprays. Sid screams and jabs upward with a sharpened table leg. Impact. The creature shrieks, collapsing into a twitching heap. It doesn't turn to dust. It just stops moving. Like a puppet with cut strings. Miguel doesn't stare. Check the apartments. They split up. Doors kicked in. People huddled in bathrooms. Kids crying. Miguel drags them out, shoving wooden weapons into shaking hands. Aim for the heart. Don't hesitate. But here's what makes his blood run cold. The vampires aren't rushing. They're herding. Pushing families toward the basements? Toward the tunnels Luis described. A plan. Controlled. Coordinated. And then the lights die completely. Pitch black. Footsteps echo below them. Slow. Confident. Not the frantic scramble of hunters. Something else is here. Something older. A voice rises from the stairwell, smooth as velvet and twice as suffocating. Children should not play war. Miguel feels it before he sees it. The air turns heavy. Breathing becomes work. The stairwell door creaks open. And the master steps into the dark. He looks almost human. That's the worst part. Tall. Calm. Dressed like a businessman closing a deal instead of ending a neighborhood. His skin isn't gray like the others. It's pale gold, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes sweep the hallway, and every smaller vampire freezes. Obedient. The master smiles at Miguel. "You have spirit," he says softly. "Your block raised you well. Strong roots. That's why we chose it." Miguel's hands shake, but he tightens his grip on the wooden stake. Behind him, families huddle. Bobby presses a towel to his bleeding arm. Sid stands too straight, trying to be braver than he feels. "You're not taking it," Miguel says. His voice cracks. He doesn't care. The master steps forward, and the air bends with him. Miguel swings first. The stake drives straight into the master's chest and stops. Like hitting stone. The master looks down at it, almost amused. "Did you think I was like them?" He grabs Miguel's wrist. Bones grind. Pain explodes. Miguel drops to one knee. This is it. He sees it now. The block empty, buildings hollowed out, generations erased. Unless? Sunlight. The faintest gray edge of dawn creeps through the broken hallway window. The master feels it too. His smile falters. Miguel forces himself up, slamming the stake again, not into the chest, into the master's eye. A sound tears through the building. Not a scream, something older. Furious. Blinding light spills across the hallway as the sun breaks fully over the Bronx rooftops. The lesser vampires ignite first. Fire races across their skin. The master staggers back, smoke pouring from his ruined face. He locks eyes with Miguel one last time, promise burning there. This isn't over. Then he dissolves into ash that scatters in the morning wind. Silence. Just sirens now. Real ones. The block survives. Scarred, shaken, but standing. Weeks later, kids play on the sidewalk again. Mrs. Rivera moves back in. The SLD signs are gone. But sometimes, at sunset, Miguel swears he sees movement in a darkened window, and he keeps a wooden stake by his bed, just in case. Ryan Fleck and Anna Boden built their careers on intimate, character-driven storytelling long before they entered the Marvel machine with Captain Marvel. But in 2020, nestled between indie grit and superhero spectacle, they produced something deceptively smaller and sneakier, Vampires vs. the Bronx, directed by Oz Rodriguez. On paper, it's a teen horror comedy for Netflix. In execution, it's a sharp, socially aware genre hybrid that uses fangs and bloodsuckers to talk about something far more grounded: gentrification, community erosion, and who gets to claim a neighborhood. The film isn't just about vampires invading the Bronx, it's about forces that already have. Oz Rodriguez, making his feature directorial debut after years directing segments for Saturday Night Live, brought with him a background in sketch comedy and fast-paced satire. That DNA shows. The film moves with comedic confidence. Jokes land quickly, visual gags slip in and out, but it never undercuts the emotional core. Rodriguez isn't parodying horror. He's playing it straight enough that the stakes matter. That tonal balance is delicate. Lean too far into comedy and the metaphor collapses. Push too hard into horror and the youthful charm evaporates. The film walks that tightrope with surprising control. The creative genesis came from screenwriters Blaze Hemingway and director Oz Rodriguez himself, but the thematic heartbeat feels deeply tied to producer Boots Riley's influence. Riley, known for Sorry to Bother You, understands allegory with teeth. You can feel that sensibility here. The idea is simple. Wealthy, pale outsiders buy up property in a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood, displace small businesses, and literally suck the life out of the community. Subtle? Not remotely. Effective? Absolutely. Horror has always been political. Think They Live or Get Out. This film slots comfortably into that lineage, just filtered through a PG-13 youth adventure lens. And here's what makes the vision click. It treats the Bronx not as backdrop, but as protagonist. Rodriguez shoots the neighborhood with warmth. Sunlight bouncing off brick buildings, corner bodegas humming with life, murals splashed with history. The opening scenes don't rush into vampire chaos. They linger. Kids on bikes, local shop owners arguing affectionately. It feels lived in. That patience matters, because when the threat arrives, you understand what's at stake, not just survival. Identity. The production found its home at Netflix, released in October 2020 prime, spooky season territory. But context matters. 2020 was a year defined by conversations about racial injustice, economic disparity, and systemic inequity. A horror comedy about marginalized kids fighting predatory invaders landed differently in that climate. What might have once played as light genre fun carried sharper edges. The film doesn't preach, but it doesn't pretend neutrality either. Its villains wear tailored suits instead of capes. They attend ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They smile too wide. Rodriguez's vision leans into accessibility. This isn't art house horror drenched in ambiguity. It's closer in spirit to The Goonies or Attack the Block. Kids banding together, discovering courage, defending home turf. That comparison isn't accidental. Attack the Block especially feels like a creative cousin, urban setting, young protagonists underestimated by society, supernatural invasion doubling as social commentary, but where Joe Cornish's film carried a grittier edge, Vampires vs. the Bronx opts for a brighter tone. It wants younger audiences in on the metaphor. Visually and structurally, the direction favors clarity over flash. Rodriguez doesn't drown the film in hyper-stylized horror aesthetics. Instead, he grounds the absurd premise in recognizable spaces, apartment hallways, local storefronts, subway entrances. When vampire attacks occur, they disrupt ordinary life rather than existing in Gothic isolation. That choice reinforces the allegory. Gentrification doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It arrives quietly, polished, marketed as improvement. There's also an undercurrent of affection running through the project. Rodriguez grew up in the Bronx. That personal connection bleeds into the texture of the film. It doesn't exoticize the neighborhood or reduce it to struggle. It shows joy, community pride, cultural specificity without explanation for outsiders. Spanish phrases flow naturally. Music pulses from car stereos. This isn't a movie explaining the Bronx to you. It assumes you're smart enough to keep up. And then there's the boldness of framing kids as defenders of cultural legacy, while adults either ignore the threat or are complicit. That's classic genre storytelling. Young heroes seeing what grown-ups can't. But here, it carries added bite. The adults are distracted by economic pressure. Rent hikes. Store closures. The vampires exploit that exhaustion. It's horror rooted in real vulnerability. That's a director understanding his metaphor and committing to it. The beauty of Rodriguez's approach is restraint. He trusts the audience to connect dots. He lets humor soften heavy themes without dissolving them. He crafts a film that works on two levels: surface-level monster adventure and deeper social critique. For younger viewers, it's kids versus vampires. For adults, it's capitalism with fangs. But a director's vision is only as strong as the blueprint beneath it. Behind every metaphor, every joke, every scare, there's a script shaping the rhythm and sharpening the stakes. And that screenplay, its structure, its evolution, its balance of horror and heart, is where the foundation of Vampires vs. the Bronx truly takes form. The brilliance of Vampires vs. the Bronx starts with a deceptively simple question. What if gentrifiers were literally vampires? It's a high-concept pitch you can imagine landing in a single sentence in a writer's room, and yet translating that into a cohesive, funny, emotionally grounded screenplay is far trickier than the hook suggests. Blaise Hemingway's script understands something crucial from the outset. Allegory only works if the characters feel real first and symbolic second. So before the fangs come out, we spend time with kids who worry about school, friendships, and saving a struggling bodega. Structurally, the film follows a clean three-act progression, almost textbook in shape, but energized by tone. Act 1 establishes the Bronx as a living organism. Miguel Martinez, our central protagonist, is trying to save his friend's family business through a block party fundraiser. That small, hyper-local goal grounds everything. The looming threat, mysterious buyers purchasing neighborhood properties, enters gradually. Disappearances happen. A sense of unease builds. The script doesn't rush to reveal its supernatural hand. It lets suspicion simmer. Here's what makes that choice smart. By the time vampires are confirmed, the audience is already invested in the neighborhood's survival. The horror element escalates stakes rather than replacing them. Compare that to many teen horror comedies where monsters feel imported purely for spectacle. Here, the supernatural grows organically from social tension. The metaphor isn't layered on top. It's baked in from page 1. The dialogue deserves credit too. It crackles with specificity. Kids talk like kids, quick, sarcastic, occasionally reckless, but never in that artificial screenwriter trying too hard way. There's rhythm to it, cultural shorthand, references that feel earned rather than Googled. When Miguel and his friends debate vampire lore, the humor comes from personality clashes, not punchlines floating in isolation. One friend is cautious. Another is obsessed with conspiracy theories. That interplay creates comedic momentum without undercutting danger. And then there's the tonal juggling act. Comedy and horror are natural cousins, but they fight for dominance if not carefully balanced. The script solves this by assigning humor to character interactions while letting horror live in the environment. Jokes happen in daylight. Suspense creeps in after dark. It's a subtle structural separation that prevents mood whiplash. Think Shaun of the Dead, where laughs and dread coexist without canceling each other out. not as sharp-edged, but operating on a similar frequency. Midway through the film, once the vampire conspiracy becomes undeniable, the narrative pivots into full adventure mode. The kids gather intel, they research weaknesses, they assemble makeshift weapons, garlic water balloons, UV flashlights. It's playful, inventive, tactile. The screenplay leans into DIY resourcefulness, reinforcing the theme of community defense. These aren't chosen ones with mystical powers. They're underfunded, underestimated teenagers using what they have. That's the heart of it. But here's the catch. The allegory risks becoming too blunt. Wealthy, pale investors dressed in sterile white interiors, draining the lifeblood of culture. It's not subtle. Some viewers might crave more nuance, yet the script isn't aiming for ambiguity. It's aiming for clarity, especially for younger audiences who may be encountering the concept of gentrification in story form for the first time. Sometimes, sharp lines communicate better than gray areas. Character arcs anchor the spectacle. Miguel begins as an optimist, believing he can save his community through positivity and organization. As the threat escalates, he's forced into leadership through confrontation rather than persuasion. That evolution feels earned because the screenplay plants seeds early. He's already organizing, already caring. The vampire threat doesn't transform him into someone new. It pushes him to amplify traits he already had. Even the antagonists benefit from deliberate construction. The lead vampire, played with icy charisma, isn't chaotic evil. He's corporate calm, measured, polite. That restraint is unnerving. The script frames him less as a snarling predator and more as a venture capitalist who happens to need blood to survive. It's satire sharpened through characterization. No monologues about domination, just quiet confidence. That's scarier. The climax follows the adventure template: rally the community, storm the lair, reclaim the block. But the emotional payoff lands because the screenplay keeps circling back to local stakes. The bodega, the friendships, the sense of belonging. The victory isn't global, it's hyper-specific. They're not saving the world, they're saving their corner of it. That scale makes it personal. If there's a weakness in the script, it's pacing in the script. The investigative middle stretches slightly, with exposition occasionally delivered a beat too directly. Yet even there, the humor keeps momentum alive. The film never stalls long enough to lose its audience. It knows it's operating within a family-friendly runtime and keeps story beats efficient. What stands out most is how the screenplay respects its young characters. They're not comic relief. They're strategists, protectors, symbols of resilience without becoming sermon devices. That balance, fun but meaningful, is hard to strike. And when it works, it gives the film its pulse. But words on a page are potential energy. They require faces, voices, chemistry actors who can sell jokes, carry emotion, and convince us that these kids could actually stand against something monstrous. The next layer of this story isn't about metaphor or structure. It's about casting choices that either elevate that blueprint or let it collapse. Casting a film like Vampires vs. the Bronx isn't about landing marquee names. It's about finding authenticity. The entire premise collapses if you don't believe these kids grew up on the same block, walked the same cracked sidewalks, argued in the same corner store aisles. Chemistry isn't a bonus here, it's structural. And that's where casting director Jessica Kelly made her most crucial contribution, assembling a trio of young leads who feel less like performers and more like lifelong friends caught in supernatural chaos. Jaden Michael anchors the film as Miguel Martinez, and the choice is deceptively sharp. Michael doesn't play Miguel as a swaggering hero. He leans into earnestness, wide-eyed determination, a kid who genuinely believes he can fix things if he organizes hard enough. That sincerity could have tipped into corny and less capable hands. Instead, Michael grounds it. His performance has a natural rhythm. He listens on screen. That's rare in young actors. Watch the quieter moments, especially when Miguel realizes adults aren't going to save the neighborhood. There's a flicker of disappointment that turns into resolve. Subtle. Controlled. Then there's Gerald W. Jones III as Bobby Carter, the conspiracy-obsessed friend who injects manic energy into every scene. On paper, Bobby risks becoming the loud comic relief archetype. But Jones gives him texture. Yes, he's paranoid. Yes, he spirals into elaborate vampire lore tangents. But beneath that is vulnerability. A kid who uses humor and hyperactivity to mask insecurity. The casting works because Jones doesn't chase punchlines. He plays conviction. He believes every wild theory he spits out. That commitment makes the comedy land. Gregory Diaz IV rounds out the trio as Luis, the heart of the group. Luis isn't as verbally dominant as Bobby or as mission-driven as Miguel, but Diaz brings warmth that anchors the ensemble. He feels like the emotional glue, the friend who hesitates before danger but shows up anyway. That balance fear mixed with loyalty creates stakes. If every kid were fearless, tension evaporates. Luis reminds us they're still teenagers, still scared. That humanity keeps the adventure grounded. The dynamic between these three actors feels lived in, and that's no accident. Strong youth ensembles often come from deliberate chemistry reads during casting. You can sense the filmmakers prioritized group interaction over individual flash. It mirrors the casting philosophy behind films like The Goonies or even Stranger Things. Assemble performers who spark off one another naturally. The jokes feel improvised even when tightly scripted. Interruptions overlap. Eye rolls feel genuine. That messiness is gold. Opposite them stands Sarah Gadon as Vivian, the lead vampire with corporate poise. Gadon's casting is inspired precisely because she doesn't play the villain with exaggerated menace. She's calm, elegant, controlled. That restraint amplifies threat. Gadon, known for work in psychological dramas and period pieces, brings an icy composure that contrasts sharply with the kinetic energy of the kids. Her performance suggests predatory patience rather than explosive violence. It's a smart counterbalance chaos versus calculation. Cliff Method Man. Smith appears as Father Jackson, and his presence carries weight beyond screen time. Casting a recognizable figure from hip-hop culture into a community leader role adds texture. He brings gravitas without overplaying authority. There's a grounded steadiness to his performance that makes the generational divide clear. Adults see change happening, but they rationalize it differently. His casting bridges cultural authenticity and mainstream recognition. Even the smaller roles feel thoughtfully chosen. Shea Whittam as Frank Polidori, the real estate broker with suspiciously smooth charm, leans into affable menace. Whigham has built a career playing morally ambiguous authority figures, and that familiarity works here. You trust him at first, then you don't. His face carries that duality effortlessly. Casting him signals to seasoned viewers that something's off long before the Fang show. What's striking is the balance between emerging talent and seasoned performers. The film doesn't overshadow its young leads with celebrity dominance. Instead, adults orbit the kids' narrative. That hierarchy reinforces theme. This is a youth-driven story. The casting supports that vision rather than hijacking it. There's also cultural specificity at play. The core trio reflects the Bronx's Black and Latino communities without turning identity into exposition. It's just there. Natural. That kind of casting matters, especially in genre films historically dominated by homogeneous casts. Representation here isn't performative, it's foundational. These kids belong to this neighborhood because they feel like they're from it. And here's the thing, casting isn't just about talent, it's about energy alignment. Michael's earnestness, Jones's volatility, Diaz's warmth, Gadon's chill, Wyam's slippery charm. Every performance style contrasts in ways that create friction on screen. Friction creates drama, drama creates engagement. But casting the right actors is only half the equation. The real magic or disaster happens once cameras roll. Talent on paper must translate into layered, lived performances. And when we zoom in on the leads themselves, their preparation, their emotional arcs, the micro-choices they make, you start to see where Vampires vs. the Bronx either elevates into something memorable or risks blending into streaming library noise. Because now, it's time to dissect the performances that carry the film's emotional weight. There's a moment midway through Vampires vs. the Bronx when Miguel realizes the adults aren't coming to save them. The camera lingers just long enough to catch the shift in his face. Hope draining, resolve hardening. Jaden Michael doesn't oversell it. No dramatic monologue, no swelling music cue to telegraph importance. Just a kid recalibrating. That restraint defines his performance. He plays Miguel not as a destined hero, but as a teenager forced to grow up faster than he planned. Michael's strength lies in stillness. In scenes where chaos unfolds, Bobby ranting, Luis panicking, vampires circling, he centers the frame. His reactions anchor tone. You believe he cares about the block party fundraiser. You believe he feels the weight of organizing something bigger than himself. That sincerity is risky in a horror comedy. Earnestness can read as naivete, but Michael threads the needle. His Miguel isn't oblivious. He's hopeful. There's a difference. And when that hope collides with reality, the performance deepens. Watch his physicality evolve. Early scenes show loose posture, relaxed shoulders, casual confidence. As the threat escalates, his body tightens. He stands straighter, moves with purpose, subtle but deliberate. It's the kind of character arc visible not in dialogue, but in stance. That's craft. Especially impressive from a young actor carrying narrative responsibility. Gerald W. Jones III, meanwhile, attacks his role with kinetic unpredictability. Bobby could have been exhausting in lesser hands, a walking meme machine firing conspiracy theories at breakneck speed. Instead, Jones injects rhythm. He knows when to accelerate and when to pull back. His line deliveries often come a half-beat faster than expected, creating comedic snap. Then, occasionally, he lets a vulnerable glance linger. It's in those micropauses you see the insecurity beneath the bravado. There's one standout sequence where Bobby's obsessive vampire knowledge finally proves useful. For a split second, pride flashes across his face. Not smugness, validation. That emotional payoff lands because Jones seeded it earlier, through defensive jokes, through the way Bobby reacts when dismissed. Comedy layered over longing. That's richer than it looks on the surface. Gregory Diaz IV's Lewis operates in a quieter register, but that doesn't mean less impact. Lewis feels fear more openly than the others. Diaz doesn't mask it. His eyes widen. His voice cracks slightly in tense moments, and that honesty becomes the audience's emotional barometer. When Luis hesitates before stepping into danger, you feel the risk. He grounds the fantasy in human response. Fear acknowledged, courage chosen anyway. What elevates the trio is their shared timing. They interrupt each other naturally. They lean into overlapping dialogue. You sense trust. That chemistry transforms scripted banter into lived friendship. It's reminiscent of early Stranger Things performances, where authenticity of interaction mattered more than polished delivery. The group dynamic sells the stakes because you care about the friendship as much as the mission. Opposite them, Sarah Gadon delivers a performance built on control. As Vivian, she rarely raises her voice. Doesn't need to. Her menace comes from composure. Perfect posture. Measured speech. Eyes that assess rather than react. It's corporate predator energy. Gadon understands that overt villain theatrics would weaken the allegory, so she opts for calm confidence, the kind that assumes victory before the fight begins. In confrontational scenes with Miguel, the contrast is striking. His passion versus her poise, his urgency versus her patience. That tension creates dramatic electricity. She doesn't chase intimidation. She lets silence do the work. A slight smile, a lingering gaze. That minimalism sharpens her presence. Cliff Method Man. Smith brings grounded authority to Father Jackson. His performance isn't flashy, but it's steady. He embodies a community elder who senses change but wrestles with how to confront it. There's weariness in his voice. Subtle, lived in. It contrasts the youthful fire of the leads. That generational tension enriches the film's emotional landscape. Even Shea Williams' real estate broker performance deserves mention. He plays affable manipulation with unnerving ease. Friendly handshake, hollow eyes. The kind of character who smiles while dismantling your home. Wiggum's ability to toggle between charm and threat adds texture to the antagonist ensemble. Collectively, the performances elevate what could have been straightforward genre fare. The kids don't just react to plot mechanics, they shape momentum. Their emotional arcs track alongside the metaphor. Courage born from community. Leadership forged under pressure. Fear acknowledged but not surrendered to. If there's any limitation, it's screen time. Certain emotional beats, especially for Lewis, could have benefited from an extra moment of quiet reflection. The film moves briskly, sometimes prioritizing plot progression over deeper introspection. Yet even within that tight runtime, the actors carve distinct identities. Here's the truth. Youth-led genre films succeed or fail on authenticity. If the performances feel manufactured, the entire adventure crumbles. Vampires vs. the Bronx avoids that trap because its leads inhabit their roles fully. They don't perform kids in a horror movie. They feel like kids defending their block. And when performances click like this, the next layer becomes crucial. How the ensemble beyond the core trio expands the world. Because even the strongest leads need a surrounding cast that enriches texture, heightens tension, and occasionally steals a scene when you least expect it. What makes Vampires vs. the Bronx feel larger than its modest runtime isn't spectacle, it's texture. And texture comes from the supporting cast. The world around Miguel and his friends breathes because the adults, shop owners, and secondary players don't feel like cardboard cutouts orbiting a teen adventure. They feel like people with routines, histories, and stakes of their own. That ensemble energy gives the film weight. Start with Method Man's Father Jackson. He could have easily been reduced to the wise community elder. Instead, Cliff Method Man Smith plays him with layered restraint. There's authority in his posture, yes, but also fatigue. The kind that comes from watching cycles repeat investment promises, rent spikes, displacement. His scenes carry a grounded gravity that balances the kid's frenetic energy. When he speaks, he doesn't grandstand. He reasons. He reflects. That calm presence anchors the film's generational dynamic, adults trying to navigate change through institutions, kids realizing institutions won't move fast enough. Shea Williams' Frank Polidori operates on the opposite frequency. Where Father Jackson embodies communal rootedness, Frank radiates slippery opportunism. Wiggum has built a career on characters who smile while calculating, and he deploys that skill here with surgical precision. His performance thrives on micro-expressions. A handshake held a second too long, a grin that never quite reaches his eyes. He doesn't chew scenery, he nibbles at it. That subtlety makes his reveal more unsettling than any overt villain monologue could. Then there's Sarah Gadon's vampire matriarch, whose presence extends beyond her direct confrontations with the kids. As part of the broader ensemble of wealthy outsiders, she establishes tonal contrast. The adult vampires move through spaces like they already own them, because, in many ways, they do. Gadon's icy composure sets the template for the rest of the coven. Polished, controlled, predatory without theatrics. The ensemble of antagonists works precisely because none of them lean into exaggerated gothic camp. They feel like developers who happen to burn in sunlight. The neighborhood characters, though, are where the film finds its emotional resonance. The bodega owners, the barber, the street vendors. These roles might seem minor in screen time, but they carry narrative significance. Each storefront represents memory, stability, cultural continuity. When those businesses close, the loss isn't abstract. The actors in these roles infuse scenes with lived-in familiarity, inside jokes, affectionate arguments, casual mentorship toward the kids. It creates a sense that this block existed long before the camera arrived. What's particularly effective is how the ensemble interacts in group scenes. The block party fundraiser sequence, for example, hums with overlapping conversations and ambient life. Extras don't stand frozen in the background, they engage, laugh, move with purpose. That communal choreography gives the setting authenticity. It doesn't feel staged. It feels inhabited. The dynamic between adults and kids also adds thematic dimension. There's skepticism from older characters when Miguel presents the vampire theory. Eye rolls, dismissals. That friction isn't played for cruelty, it's realism. Adults under financial stress aren't quick to entertain supernatural explanations. The ensemble's grounded reactions prevent the premise from tipping into cartoon logic. They respond the way real people would. And that normalcy makes the horror intrusion sharper. One of the film's quiet strengths is how it avoids caricaturing either side completely. Yes, the vampires represent predatory gentrification, but not every new face is demonized. The screenplay and performances leave room for ambiguity in certain interactions, especially among bystanders. That nuance softens what could have been a blunt, moral binary. The ensemble reflects complexity without losing clarity. Chemistry extends beyond the core trio. Watch how supporting actors respond during tense moments. Fear ripples differently across faces. Some freeze, some deny, some react with anger. Those varied emotional responses create a spectrum of realism. It's not one-note panic, it's layered human reaction. And here's where ensemble balance becomes crucial. No supporting performance overshadows the kids. That's intentional. The adults add stakes but never steal agency. Even in climactic sequences, the energy remains youth-driven. The ensemble amplifies rather than dominates. If there's a limitation, it's that certain side characters could have used deeper development, an extra beat here, a more personal stake there. The brisk runtime keeps focus tight, occasionally at the expense of richer backstories. But within those constraints, the ensemble accomplishes its purpose. building a believable ecosystem around the protagonists. Ultimately, the supporting cast ensures the Bronx feels like more than a setting. It becomes a collective character, a tapestry of personalities reacting to intrusion. And when that world is threatened, the loss feels tangible because the faces populating it feel specific. Of course, performances exist within physical space. Sets, streets, storefronts. These aren't neutral backdrops. They shape mood, symbolism, and immersion. And in a story where environment equals identity, production design carries enormous thematic weight. That's where the film's visual craftsmanship steps forward. The first thing you notice about Vampires vs. the Bronx isn't the vampires. It's the color. Warm brick reds, murals bursting with blues and yellows, storefront awnings faded by years of sun. Production designer Lisa Myers doesn't treat the Bronx as a generic urban backdrop. She treats it like a layered canvas. Every block feels lived in, scuffed, personal, and that lived-in quality becomes the emotional baseline the film fights to protect. Look closely at the neighborhood spaces. The bodega shelves aren't sparsely dressed with random props. They're cluttered, overstocked, slightly chaotic. Handwritten price signs, candy brands stacked in imperfect rows. There's a tactile density to these interiors. It's not glossy, it's specific. That specificity matters because when those spaces are later threatened or emptied, the loss registers visually before it's spoken aloud. Production design here isn't decorative, it's narrative. Contrast that with the Vampires' environments. Clean lines, minimalist interiors, stark white walls that feel almost sterile. Glass and metal dominating the frame. The difference is immediate and intentional. Warmth versus coldness. History versus blank slate. The design isn't subtle about its metaphor, but it doesn't need to be. The visual language reinforces the thematic divide without requiring exposition. You see the cultural erasure in architecture alone. And here's the smart part. The Vampires' spaces don't look traditionally Gothic. No cobwebs. No candlelit crypts. Instead, their layers resemble luxury real estate showrooms, high ceilings, expansive windows. The horror comes from how ordinary and aspirational these spaces appear. That choice modernizes vampire mythology. It aligns predatory power with wealth aesthetics rather than ancient castles. It's horror embedded in capitalism's clean surfaces. Costume design supports that divide beautifully. The kids wear hoodies, sneakers, basketball shorts, clothes that move easily, that feel authentic to their environment. Nothing overly stylized, just lived reality. Meanwhile, the vampires dress in tailored suits and muted palettes, sharp silhouettes, controlled presentation. Their fashion communicates authority and detachment simultaneously. You don't need dialogue to understand hierarchy. It's stitched into fabric. Lighting interacts with these design choices in subtle ways. Daytime Bronx scenes glow with natural warmth, sunlight bouncing off brick and pavement. Night sequences cool slightly but retain environmental texture. In vampire-dominated spaces, however, light feels flatter, more artificial. Even before supernatural elements come into play, the atmosphere signals discomfort. The production design and lighting collaborate to create emotional temperature shifts. There's also attention to small world details. Murals on walls aren't generic street art. They reflect cultural pride, local history. Background signage carries Spanish phrases without translation. These aren't Easter eggs for outsiders. They are authentic markers of place. That commitment prevents the setting from feeling like a Hollywood approximation of the Bronx. It feels rooted. One standout sequence takes place in a recently purchased building that's been quietly stripped of its former character. Empty hallways. Echoing footsteps. The absence of clutter becomes eerie. Negative space replaces warmth. It's a visual metaphor for displacement rooms that once held stories now hollowed out. The production design leans into emptiness as a threat. Sometimes what's missing is scarier than what's present. Even the DIY weapons the kids assemble carry design personality. Garlic-filled water balloons, homemade stakes, UV flashlights rigged together. These props aren't slick gadgets. They're cobbled solutions. You can imagine the kids assembling them on a kitchen table. That tactile realism enhances charm and reinforces theme, resourcefulness born from limited means. What elevates the production design further is its refusal to glamorize struggle. The neighborhood isn't portrayed as gritty misery nor sanitized nostalgia. It's balanced. There's wear and tear, yes, but also vibrancy. Pride. That balance keeps the film from romanticizing poverty while still celebrating community identity. If there's a critique, it might be that the visual metaphor occasionally borders on overt. The contrast between warm, crowded Bronx spaces and sterile vampire domains leaves little room for interpretive ambiguity. But clarity seems to be the point. This is a story accessible to younger viewers. The design communicates theme instantly. Ultimately, production design in Vampires vs. the Bronx does heavy lifting. It establishes stakes before dialogue. It sharpens allegory without speeches. It transforms environment into emotional battleground. The Bronx isn't just defended through action, it's defended through visual storytelling. And once those spaces are built, dressed, and lit, the next question becomes how they're captured. Because a neighborhood can be beautifully designed, but it takes a specific eye behind the camera to translate that physical world into cinematic language. That's where cinematography steps in, shaping how we see what's at risk. There's a shot early in Vampires vs. the Bronx where the camera trails Miguel and his friends biking down a sunlit street, brick buildings stretching behind them like guardians. It's simple. No flashy crane movement, no hyper-stylized lens distortion, but the framing tells you everything. This is their territory. Cinematographer Michael Watson approaches the film with that same philosophy throughout, grounded, observant, letting the neighborhood breathe before the horror seeps in. Watson avoids the hyper-slick gloss that often coats streaming genre projects. Instead, he favors naturalistic lighting, especially in daytime exteriors. Sunlight isn't aggressively filtered. It spills across faces, occasionally overexposing edges in a way that feels organic rather than manicured. That choice reinforces authenticity. The Bronx isn't romanticized through golden haze. It's shown as vibrant and real. You feel heat bouncing off pavement. You sense humidity in the air. Camera movement follows character energy. With the kids, the lens often tracks at their height, handheld but controlled. There's slight kinetic wobble during moments of urgency chases, discoveries, but it never becomes chaotic. The motion mirrors youthful restlessness without sacrificing clarity. Compare that to the vampire sequences, where framing tightens. Shots become more symmetrical. Movement slows. Composure replaces spontaneity. It's subtle visual coding. Community equals fluidity. Corporate predation equals rigidity. Night sequences deserve particular attention. Rather than drenching scenes in heavy blue filters, a common horror shortcut, Watson opts for shadow layering. Darkness feels dimensional. Streetlights cast uneven pools of amber. Corners disappear into soft black rather than pitch void. That restraint keeps the film accessible to younger viewers while maintaining tension. You can see what's happening, but unease lingers in the negative space. One standout visual motif involves thresholds, doorways, hallways, windows. The camera frequently frames characters within these architectural borders, emphasizing intrusion. When vampires enter a space, they're often positioned just beyond a frame within the frame. Watching. Waiting. That compositional choice amplifies the theme of outsiders encroaching on protected ground. It's visual storytelling without dialogue. Aspect ratio remains standard widescreen, but Watson uses depth cleverly. Foreground objects, fences, door frames, store displays, often partially obscure the frame. It creates layered compositions that echo the film's thematic layering. The Bronx isn't a flat backdrop, it's textured, crowded, alive. By contrast, vampire-owned spaces are shot with cleaner lines and fewer obstructions. Depth flattens slightly, enhancing sterility. Color grading collaborates closely with production design. Warm tones dominate community scenes, earthy reds, oranges, natural skin tones. When the story shifts into vampire territory, the palette cools subtly. Whites become harsher, shadows deepen. It's not dramatic enough to feel like a genre shift, but it's perceptible. Emotional temperature shifts with environment. Action sequences remain relatively contained. This isn't a bombastic CGI spectacle. Instead, Watson keeps confrontations intimate. Close to mid-shots during stake-wielding chaos allow us to stay connected to facial reactions. Horror is personal here. When UV light flashes against a vampire's skin, the camera doesn't cut away too quickly. It lingers just enough for impact, but avoids gratuitous detail. The balance preserves tone. There's also smart use of practical effects integration. Rather than relying heavily on digital spectacle, many vampire reactions are captured in-camera with controlled lighting bursts and prosthetics enhanced later. Watson's lighting setups accommodate that hybrid approach. The result feels cohesive rather than over-rendered. texture remains intact. If there's a limitation, it's that the film rarely takes bold visual risks. You won't find audacious long takes or radical perspective shifts, but that restraint aligns with the director's broader vision, clarity over flourish. The cinematography serves story first. It doesn't demand attention, it guides it. One particularly effective sequence unfolds in a dimly lit apartment building hallway. The kids move cautiously, flashlights cutting narrow beams through darkness. The camera stays just behind them, creating a sense of shared vulnerability. Every flicker feels amplified. You're not watching heroes conquer a threat, you're moving with kids who could easily lose. That proximity builds empathy. Ultimately, Watson's work ensures the film's allegory remains grounded. The camera never floats into fantasy abstraction. It stays anchored to sidewalks, storefronts, stoops. Even when supernatural elements ignite, the lens keeps one foot in reality. That balance allows the metaphor to resonate without overwhelming younger viewers. Of course, what we see is only half the equation. Atmosphere doesn't just live in shadow and color. It hums in the background, pulses in rhythm, creeps in through sound. Because when the screen goes dark and tension builds, it's often the audio landscape that makes your pulse climb before you even know why. And that's where the film's music and sound design quietly shape the experience. Before a single vampire hisses, before a UV light flares against pale skin, Vampires vs. the Bronx establishes tone through sound. You hear the neighborhood first, music spilling from passing cars, distant conversations overlapping, the hum of traffic weaving through side streets. That layered ambient design matters because it builds a sonic baseline of life. When that baseline starts thinning, when storefronts close, when night falls, the silence feels unnatural. Sound design here isn't flashy, it's strategic. The score, composed by the Math Club, leans into playful tension rather than oppressive dread. Synth textures pulse beneath scenes without overwhelming them. There's a lightness to the instrumentation. Subtle electronic beats mixed with understated orchestral swells that keeps the film accessible for younger audiences. This isn't bone-rattling horror scoring designed to induce panic. It's suspense with bounce. The music nudges you forward rather than shoving you into fear. One clever choice is how the score often recedes during comedic exchanges. Dialogue-driven humor breathes without being smothered by musical cues. Then, when danger creeps in, low-frequency synth tones slip under the frame almost invisibly. You don't always register the shift consciously. You feel it. Your pulse climbs slightly. That's controlled scoring, guiding emotion without announcing itself. There's a recurring motif built around quick, staccato electronic notes that surfaces whenever the kids pivot into action mode. It's not heroic fanfare. It's scrappy, energetic, almost DIY in spirit. That musical identity mirrors the homemade weapons and improvised plans. Compare that to the vampire-associated cues, longer sustained tones, smoother and colder in texture. The contrast isn't loud, but it's consistent. Warm rhythm versus icy sustain. Sound design during vampire encounters deserves attention. When fangs emerge or skin reacts to UV light, the audio doesn't explode into grotesque exaggeration. Instead, there's a restrained crackle, a sizzle that feels contained. The mix avoids gratuitous gore emphasis. It keeps horror tactile but not traumatizing. That calibration ensures younger viewers remain engaged without being alienated. Silence also becomes a tool. In one hallway sequence, ambient city noise drops away almost completely. No distant sirens, no music from cars, just footsteps and shallow breathing. That subtraction creates tension more effectively than layered noise ever could. Silence becomes a vacuum, and vacuums demand attention. The film integrates diegetic sound audio that exists within the world beautifully. Block party music pulses through speakers in early scenes, creating communal rhythm. Later, when spaces empty out, that diegetic vibrancy disappears. The absence reinforces theme. Culture isn't just visual, it's sonic. When music fades from the block, you feel the loss. Dialogue mixing is clean, allowing overlapping conversations without muddiness. That's particularly important with the core trio, whose banter often overlaps naturally. The mix preserves authenticity while keeping lines intelligible. It's a delicate balance. Too clean and it sounds staged, too messy and jokes vanish. The film threads that needle. There's also subtle spatial audio design at play. In vampire-owned buildings, echoes linger slightly longer. Footsteps reverberate unnaturally in hallways stripped of furnishings. the soundscape becomes hollow. By contrast, Bronx interiors feel acoustically crowded, sound absorbed by clutter, softened by fabric, dampened by lived-in density. You might not consciously notice that difference, but your brain does. Full rooms feel safe. Empty rooms feel exposed. One standout auditory beat arrives during a confrontation where UV lights ignite. The brief electrical hum that accompanies activation blends with score, blurring the line between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. That merging heightens urgency without relying on volume spikes. It's tension built through texture rather than shock. If there's any limitation, it's that the score rarely ventures into daring melodic territory. Themes are effective, but not particularly memorable outside the film's context. You won't be humming motifs days later. But that may be intentional. The music supports rather than dominates. It serves story rather than seeking spotlight. Ultimately, the audio landscape of Vampires vs. Escape. The Bronx reinforces its tonal balancing act. Suspense without trauma. Energy without chaos. Community vibrancy contrasted with corporate emptiness. Sound becomes another layer of allegory, life humming until something drains it. And while the finished product feels cohesive, smooth in its tonal shifts, films rarely come together without friction behind the scenes. Schedules tighten. Budget strain. Weather disrupts. Young actors navigate first major productions. For every polished frame and carefully mixed cue, there's a production journey filled with improvisation, problem-solving, and the kind of near misses that never make the trailer. That behind-the-scenes story? It adds another dimension entirely. On screen, Vampires vs. All. The Bronx feels breezy kids on bikes, quick-witted banter, vampires dissolving under UV light. Behind the scenes, though, the production carried the usual cocktail of logistical pressure and creative problem-solving, amplified by the fact that this was Oz Rodriguez's first feature. Television and sketch comedy move fast, but a feature demands endurance, longer days, sustained tone, cohesion across weeks of shooting. That transition alone becomes a quiet test of leadership. The film shot primarily in New York, with Bronx locations playing a central role in grounding authenticity. That decision matters. Shooting on real streets instead of constructing artificial backlots injects unpredictability, ambient noise, weather shifts, curious onlookers. But it also injects texture you can't fake. The production had to navigate permits, coordinate around active neighborhoods, and capture usable takes while life continued around them. Controlled chaos. Fitting for a story about defending a living block. Working with a young cast adds another layer of complexity. Jaden Michael, Gerald W. Jones III, and Gregory Diaz IV carry significant screen time, which means scheduling around labor laws, balancing school requirements, and maintaining energy over extended shoot days. Youth performances can't be wrung out through endless takes. Freshness matters. Rodriguez reportedly fostered an environment that encouraged looseness between setups, keeping the trio's camaraderie alive off-camera so it translated naturally on-screen. Chemistry isn't just cast, it's maintained. Genre filmmaking on a streaming budget also demands creativity. This isn't a 9-figure studio horror spectacle. Practical effects had to stretch. Vampire transformations rely on a blend of prosthetics, makeup, and controlled visual effects rather than CGI excess. That hybrid approach requires coordination between departments. Makeup timing, lighting adjustments, camera angles that sell the illusion without exposing seams. When it works, it feels seamless. When it doesn't, it risks looking rushed. The production wisely keeps effects contained and story-driven, avoiding sequences that would overextend resources. One particularly challenging aspect likely involved night shoots. Horror thrives after dark, but night filming slows everything down. Lighting setups become more intricate. Continuity grows trickier. Fatigue creeps in. Add child actors to that equation and schedules tighten further. The hallway sequences and street confrontations required controlled darkness without losing clarity, meaning careful coordination between cinematography and production design under time pressure. Then, there's tone management on set. Horror comedy can fracture easily if the creative team isn't aligned. Push performances too far into parody and stakes dissolve. Lean too heavily into fear, and younger audiences disengage. Rodriguez's background in comedy probably helped calibrate that balance. Sketch directors are trained to find rhythm quickly, to know when a joke has peaked. That instinct translates to pacing horror beats. holding tension just long enough before releasing it. Netflix's production model also influences process. Without theatrical box office pressure during filming, there's often more freedom in content calibration, but also the reality that streaming films compete in an overcrowded digital library. That knowledge shapes creative urgency. The film needed to stand out visually and thematically without ballooning budget. Allegory became its differentiator. Another behind-the-scenes dynamic worth noting is the cultural authenticity woven into production. Filming in communities represented on screen requires sensitivity, local extras, cultural consultants, respect for environment. When a movie centers a real neighborhood, it inherits responsibility. Reports from set emphasized community engagement, ensuring the Bronx wasn't just used as aesthetic, but included in the storytelling process. That collaboration deepens credibility. Of course, 2020 loomed large over the film's release. Though shot prior to the pandemic's full global impact, its October 2020 debut landed squarely in a year dominated by social upheaval and economic anxiety. Thematically, the film felt eerily timely. Conversations about displacement, systemic inequality, and community resilience were already front-page realities. What began as genre allegory suddenly felt like commentary. Reshoots and refinements are standard in post-production, especially for tone calibration. Balancing humor against horror often requires trimming jokes that undercut tension or tightening suspense that drags. The film's brisk pacing suggests careful editing decisions, streamlining second-act investigation beats while preserving character moments. That discipline in the edit suite shapes the final rhythm more than audiences realize. Behind every clean 90-minute runtime lies weeks of compromise, experimentation, and adjustment. Sets built and struck. Effects tested and refined. Performances recalibrated. The magic of filmmaking is how invisible that labor becomes when done well. Vampires vs. the Bronx wears its production lightly, but that lightness is engineered. And once the camera stopped rolling and the final cut locked, the question shifted from creative survival to commercial reality. In a streaming-dominated landscape, success isn't measured solely in ticket sales. It's measured in viewership numbers, cultural footprint, and whether a film finds its audience amid endless scrolling. So how did this scrappy vampire allegory perform when released into the wild? When Vampires vs. the Bronx premiered on Netflix in October 2020, it entered a radically different marketplace than most theatrical horror comedies before it. There was no opening weekend box office headline, no Friday night theater lines. Instead, it dropped into an algorithm. One tile among thousands during a year when streaming consumption had skyrocketed due to global lockdowns. Success, in this environment, becomes harder to quantify publicly but no less significant. Because Netflix does not routinely release detailed viewership numbers for every title, exact audience metrics for the film weren't widely disclosed. What we do know is that the film debuted during peak Halloween season, a strategic release window when genre content thrives on the platform. Netflix has historically leaned into October horror drops, and Vampires vs. the Bronx fit neatly into that seasonal push, family-friendly enough for teen audiences, but thematic enough to spark adult curiosity. Financially, the film operated in a different paradigm. Without theatrical exhibition, traditional production budget-to-box office comparisons don't apply. However, its mid-scale production design, contained visual effects, and limited A-list salaries suggest a controlled budget relative to major studio horror projects. In streaming economics, value isn't just about raw viewership, it's about retention. Does the film attract subscribers? Does it keep them engaged? Does it broaden demographic appeal? By centering Black and Latino youth within a genre framework, the film positioned itself as culturally distinct within Netflix's horror lineup. The streaming landscape also alters longevity. Theatrical films often live or die by their first 2 weekends. Streaming films accumulate gradually. They resurface each October. They find new audiences months later. A teen in 2023 might stumble across Vampires vs. the Bronx the same way someone did on release day. That evergreen Halloween placement gives it quiet staying power. Commercial impact also extends beyond numbers. The film reinforced Netflix's growing investment in diverse genre storytelling. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, the platform leaned heavily into horror with social undercurrents. His house, the platform, Fear Street. Vampires vs. the Bronx fit that strategic pattern, elevated themes wrapped in accessible thrills. It demonstrated that allegorical horror didn't have to be grim or R-rated to resonate. If we compare it to theatrical horror comedies like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark or Goosebumps, those films had clearer financial benchmarks. But they also carried higher marketing costs and box office risk. Streaming reduces that volatility. For Netflix, the question wasn't whether it would cross a specific revenue threshold, it was whether it added value to the platform's Halloween slate and brand identity. By most industry assessments, it did exactly that, broadened genre offerings while appealing to younger viewers seeking representation. Home media revenue streams, once critical to mid-budget genre films, are largely absorbed into streaming ecosystems now. Instead of DVD sales and Blu-ray collectors, engagement metrics and completion rates become the currency. While we don't have granular data, the film's continued visibility on curated Halloween recommendation lists suggests it achieved durable engagement rather than disappearing into obscurity. Culturally, the film also gained traction through word of mouth and social media discourse. Viewers highlighted its gentrification metaphor, often sharing clips and commentary that reframed it as more than just a kid's vampire movie. In streaming culture, virality can function as marketing long after release. A meme, a clip, a tweet thread. That digital afterlife contributes to a project's commercial relevance in ways box office charts can't capture. There's also long-tail value in casting emerging actors. Jaden Michael's later casting in high-profile projects retroactively draws attention back to earlier performances. When young stars rise, audiences revisit their breakout roles. Streaming platforms benefit from that recursive discovery cycle. Catalog becomes asset. If there's a commercial limitation, it's that streaming releases rarely generate the cultural event status of theatrical premieres, especially mid-budget genre films without massive marketing pushes. Vampires vs. the Bronx didn't dominate headlines or spawn merchandise lines. It didn't become a franchise launchpad. But not every film needs to. Some function as solid, steady contributors to a platform's identity rather than tentpole centerpieces. And in the broader industry context of 2020, when theaters were shuttered and streaming became primary distribution, projects like this helped redefine what success looked like. Modest budgets, focused themes, targeted seasonal placement. It's a different kind of win. Of course, commercial performance only tells part of the story. Numbers, when available, measure reach. They don't measure reception. A film can quietly accumulate viewers yet spark passionate critical debate. It can divide reviewers while finding devoted audiences. It can age better than its opening weekend headlines ever suggested. So how did critics respond? Did they see sharp allegory beneath the humor, or dismiss it as lightweight genre fare? And perhaps more interestingly, how did audiences interpret its bite? That cultural conversation reveals as much about the film as any financial metric ever could. Critically, Vampires vs. the Persis. The Bronx landed in an interesting space, praised for its heart and cultural specificity, occasionally critiqued for playing things safe. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds a strong approval rating from critics, reflecting generally positive consensus, while audience scores track closely behind. That alignment matters. Horror comedy often splits critics and viewers. Here, both camps largely agreed. It's charming, socially aware, and refreshingly centered on underrepresented communities. Many reviewers highlighted the film's gentrification metaphor as its sharpest asset. The idea of vampires as literal culture-draining developers isn't subtle, but critics noted that its clarity made it accessible to younger audiences without diluting its bite. Several comparisons surfaced repeatedly in reviews: Attack the Block for its urban monster-fighting energy, and The Goonies for its scrappy youth adventure vibe. Those parallels position the film within a lineage of kid-led genre stories that respect their protagonists' intelligence. That said, not every critic was fully convinced by its execution. Some argued the allegory bordered on heavy-handed, suggesting the metaphor occasionally overshadowed narrative nuance. The villains, while effective symbolically, were seen by a few reviewers as lacking psychological complexity. Corporate predators with fangs, efficient but not layered. Yet even in critiques, there was acknowledgement that the film wasn't aiming for moral ambiguity. It was aiming for clarity, especially for younger viewers encountering systemic themes for the first time. Performance reviews leaned positive, particularly for the core trio. Jaden Michael's grounded sincerity earned frequent praise, with critics noting how his performance anchored the film emotionally. Gerald W. Jones III's comedic timing drew attention as a highlight, and Gregory Diaz IV's warmth was often cited as the glue holding the group dynamic together. The ensemble's chemistry became one of the most consistently celebrated elements across reviews. Culturally, the film sparked conversation beyond standard horror discourse. Viewers from Bronx communities expressed appreciation for seeing their neighborhoods depicted with affection rather than stereotype. Social media threads pointed out small details, murals, slang, local references, that resonated authentically. Representation in genre storytelling isn't new, but centering Black and Latino teens as heroes in a vampire narrative felt refreshing rather than tokenistic. The timing of its release in 2020 amplified its thematic relevance. Amid national conversations about racial justice and economic disparity, the film's allegory didn't feel abstract. It felt immediate. Critics and audiences alike framed it as part of a broader wave of socially conscious horror emerging in the late 2010s and early 2020s. While not as tonally intense as Get Out or Us, it participated in that evolving genre conversation, proving horror could engage systemic issues at multiple audience levels. Awards recognition was modest, as expected for a mid-budget streaming horror comedy. It didn't dominate major ceremonies, but absence from awards doesn't equate to absence of impact. Genre films, especially youth-oriented ones, often gain cultural longevity outside trophy circuits. Their influence shows up in Halloween rewatches, classroom discussions, and streaming recommendation lists rather than Oscar ballots. Audience reactions, particularly among younger viewers, leaned enthusiastic. Many embraced its adventure tone and DIY energy. For teens navigating their own neighborhood's changes, the metaphor resonated viscerally. Adults appreciated the layered commentary. That cross-generational appeal is rare. Too often, family-friendly horror flattens themes to avoid discomfort. Vampires vs. the Bronx kept its bite while maintaining accessibility. There was also discussion around its tonal restraint. Some horror fans craving darker intensity found it too gentle. Stakes, while emotionally clear, never reached traumatic levels. But that's a design choice. The film positions itself closer to gateway horror, a stepping stone for younger audiences discovering genre allegory. Measured scares over shock therapy. Long-term, its reputation has settled into something steady rather than explosive. It's not hailed as a genre-defining classic. It's not dismissed as disposable streaming filler either. It occupies a middle ground, a well-crafted, culturally resonant piece that enriches the horror comedy landscape without reinventing it. And sometimes that's enough. Not every film needs to revolutionize genre to matter. Some strengthen foundations. Some expand who gets to be the hero. Some prove that metaphors can carry across age groups without losing clarity. Which brings us to the final question, the one that lingers after credits roll. Beyond performance metrics and review aggregates, beyond production anecdotes and design analysis, what does Vampires vs. the Bronx ultimately say? What themes endure? What legacy might it carve out over time? Because beneath the fangs and flashlights, beneath the jokes and jump scares, there's something more deliberate pulsing through its veins. And that's where the story's final layer reveals itself. At its core, Vampires vs. the Bronx isn't really about vampires. It's about ownership. Who gets to define a neighborhood? Who decides what improvement looks like? And who pays the price when progress arrives wearing a polished smile? Strip away the fangs and UV flashlights, and what remains is a story about cultural survival told through the language of genre. The film's central theme, gentrification as literal bloodsucking, isn't subtle. But subtlety was never the goal. The power lies in accessibility. By reframing systemic displacement as a monster movie, the film translates economic abstraction into visceral stakes. Kids understand monsters. They understand defending home. Through that lens, complex social dynamics become tangible. You can't fight a rent hike with a wooden stake, but you can fight a vampire. The metaphor empowers where reality often feels overwhelming. Community emerges as the film's emotional spine, not just friendship between Miguel, Bobby, and Luis, but intergenerational connection. Store owners, church leaders, families who've lived on the block for decades. The movie argues that a neighborhood isn't defined by property values, it's defined by memory and shared space. When storefronts vanish, it's not just commerce lost, it's identity eroded. There's also a coming-of-age thread woven quietly through the horror. Miguel begins the film believing organization and optimism can solve everything. By the end, he understands leadership sometimes requires confrontation. Courage isn't loud, it's consistent. The shift from fundraiser planning to monster hunting isn't just plot escalation, it's maturation. Childhood idealism collides with adult reality, and instead of retreating, he adapts. The film also interrogates invisibility. The vampires operate because people don't see them clearly. They blend in. They attend community meetings. They offer opportunities. That commentary cuts deeper than jump scares. Harm doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it signs contracts. That's a sharp lesson delivered through family-friendly horror. Visually and tonally, the movie resists nihilism. It doesn't suggest displacement is inevitable or resistance futile. Instead, it champions collective action, even if that action is scrappy and imperfect. The kids don't defeat the threat alone, they rally the block. That communal victory reinforces the idea that systemic issues require unified response. No lone hero mythology here. Survival is collaborative. Does the film revolutionize horror? No. It doesn't reinvent vampire lore or shatter genre conventions. Its narrative structure is familiar. Its metaphors are clearly drawn. But impact isn't always about innovation. Sometimes it's about representation within familiar frameworks. Black and Latino teens as monster-fighting protagonists. The Bronx portrayed with warmth rather than stereotype. That visibility carries its own quiet legacy. In the landscape of socially conscious horror, Vampires vs. the Bronx occupies an accessible middle ground. Less psychologically harrowing than Get Out. Less gritty than Attack the Block. But that tonal softness is strategic. It opens the door for younger audiences to engage with allegory without alienation. Gateway horror with purpose. Rewatchability becomes part of its staying power. Every October, when streaming platforms resurface horror titles, this one fits comfortably into rotation. It's seasonal without being disposable. And its themes, economic pressure, cultural erasure, youth resilience, aren't locked to 2020. They're ongoing conversations. If there's a critique to land in a final verdict, it's this. The film occasionally plays it safe. The villains could have been layered further. Certain emotional beats could have lingered longer. Greater stylistic risks might have elevated it from solid to unforgettable. But safety doesn't negate sincerity, and sincerity pulses through every frame. Ultimately, Vampires vs. the Bronx succeeds because it understands its audience and its mission. It entertains, it empowers, it sparks conversation without sermonizing. It proves that genre storytelling can carry social commentary without sacrificing fun, and maybe that's its quiet triumph. It hands young viewers a metaphor sharp enough to recognize the world around them, and a story hopeful enough to suggest they can change it. Fangs out. Stakes raised. Block defended. What makes Miguel compelling isn't just that he fights vampires, it's that he starts the film trying to save his neighborhood through optimism. Fundraisers, flyers, belief. That instinct reveals something deeper. He wants to matter. He wants agency in a world that quietly sidelines kids. The vampire invasion forces a psychological shift. Hope alone won't cut it. Leadership demands confrontation. That internal pivot is the real coming-of-age arc. Early Miguel believes systems can be persuaded. By the end, he understands systems sometimes have to be resisted. That's heavy territory for a youth horror comedy. Yet the film never frames his evolution as bitterness. It frames it as awakening. Childhood isn't stripped away violently, it matures under pressure. That nuance matters. The story doesn't say, the world is cruel. It says, the world is complicated, and you're capable of facing it. Bobby's psychology runs parallel but different. His conspiracy obsession isn't just comic energy, it's armor. Kids who feel overlooked often construct alternate realities where they're the only ones paying attention. When his outlandish vampire theories prove true, it's more than validation. It's belonging. He wasn't crazy, he was observant. That's a subtle but powerful message for young viewers who feel dismissed. Luis represents another psychological layer. Fear acknowledged. He doesn't leap into danger eagerly. He hesitates. His courage is conscious. That's critical. Too many youth adventure stories equate bravery with recklessness. Here, bravery looks like stepping forward despite shaking hands. The film validates anxiety without glorifying paralysis. Even the vampires operate psychologically rather than purely physically. They don't just drain blood, they exploit invisibility. They rely on exhaustion, communities too tired to question incremental change. That's not just metaphorical economics, it's behavioral commentary. Predatory systems function best when people are distracted, divided, or resigned. And then there's space itself as psychological pressure. Notice how the kids move freely in early scenes. Open streets, rooftops, basketball courts. As the vampire presence grows, scenes constrict, hallways narrow, interiors empty. The physical environment mirrors tightening options. It's subtle, but it reinforces internal tension. The Bronx starts as playground. It becomes battleground. What's fascinating is that the film never fully demonizes change. It demonizes erasure. That distinction is important. Progress isn't framed as evil. Predatory replacement is. The vampires don't coexist, they consume. That's the line the story draws clearly for younger viewers. Improvement without preservation becomes destruction. Within vampire mythology itself, that's a modern twist. Traditional cinematic vampires, from Dracula to Interview with the Vampire, represent aristocracy, forbidden desire, or existential immortality. They're often romanticized, seductive, ancient. Here, they're venture capitalists with eternal lifespans. No capes, no gothic castles, just investment portfolios and sterile apartments. That reframing shifts horror from mythic past to contemporary present. Classic vampires invade villages under cover of darkness. These vampires buy property legally. That's more unsettling. It suggests threat hides within systems we already accept. There's no need for dramatic transformation sequences or operatic villain speeches. The horror lies in bureaucracy. Yet the film doesn't abandon traditional lore entirely. Sunlight still burns. Stakes still work. Garlic still matters. That adherence to familiar rules keeps the story accessible. It's a clever balancing act. Update the metaphor, preserve the mechanics. Young audiences learn classic vampire rules while absorbing modern social commentary. There's also a fascinating tonal discipline in how the film avoids glamorizing its monsters. Many contemporary vampire stories lean into allure, seduction, charisma. Here, the vampires are polished but emotionally hollow. Their wealth aesthetic replaces sensual mystique. They're not desirable. They're aspirational in the way luxury condos are aspirational. Impressive, but soulless. That's deliberate. Because at the heart of the film is a rejection of aspiration without roots. The Bronx in this story isn't portrayed as something to escape. It's something worth defending. That flips a long-standing cinematic pattern where urban neighborhoods function as stepping stones toward elsewhere. Here, elsewhere is the threat. Home is the prize. And that thematic choice becomes even more powerful when viewed through the lens of family-friendly horror. Making a film politically conscious without alienating younger viewers requires restraint. The violence is contained. The horror is suggestive rather than graphic. The message is clear but not didactic. It trusts young audiences to connect dots without delivering lectures. That trust might be the film's quietest strength. It assumes kids can recognize injustice when framed through monsters. It assumes they can grasp a metaphor. It assumes they can see parallels between supernatural invasion and real-world displacement. And in doing so, it empowers rather than patronizes. So where does that leave its long-term legacy? Perhaps not as a genre-redefining classic, not as a blockbuster phenomenon, but as a blueprint. Proof that youth-oriented horror can engage systemic themes. Proof that representation in genre stories doesn't require trauma to feel authentic. Proof that you can make a vampire movie about capitalism and keep it fun. And in an era where streaming libraries overflow with content chasing shock value, there's something quietly radical about a film that chooses clarity, community, and accessible allegory over spectacle excess. The monsters burn. The block survives, but the ideas linger. Traditionally, cinematic vampires embody aristocratic excess. Count Dracula arrives from a crumbling castle draped in old-world decadence. Even modern iterations, Twilight, True Blood, The Vampire Diaries, wrap immortality in sensual mystique. Vampires are seductive outsiders. Dangerous, yes, but alluring. Power feels glamorous. This film rejects that completely. There's no romance here, no gothic longing, no tortured immortality monologues. The vampires aren't ancient relics clinging to lost eras. They're hyper-modern, clean, corporate. Their power isn't erotic, it's economic. And that shift matters. Think about what that means symbolically. Classic vampires drain individuals. These vampires drain communities. The scale changes. The horror moves from personal seduction to systemic consumption. You're not worried about one victim in a foggy alley. You're worried about an entire block being hollowed out. That evolution aligns the film more with socially conscious horror than supernatural romance. If Nosferatu reflected post-war anxiety and Bram Stoker's Dracula leaned into repressed desire, Vampires vs. the Bronx reflects late-stage capitalism. The monster adapts to the era's fear. And the fear today isn't a mysterious stranger in a cape. It's displacement. What's fascinating is how the film preserves traditional vampire rules while updating symbolic function. Sunlight still burns, stakes still pierce, garlic still repels. Those rules anchor familiarity. But the context shifts the emotional resonance. When UV light scorches these vampires, it feels less like defeating myth and more like exposing corruption. Exposure. That's the new vulnerability. Older vampire lore fixates on mirrors, creatures without reflection. Here, the metaphor becomes cultural reflection. The vampires don't reflect the neighborhood because they don't belong to it. They exist parasitically. The absence isn't supernatural, it's social. And unlike romantic vampire stories, this film refuses to give its monsters tragic backstories. No centuries of loneliness, no existential dread. They're predators, period. That simplicity reinforces clarity of message. When you're explaining structural inequality to younger viewers, moral gray zones can muddy the lesson. The film opts for sharp lines, yet it avoids cartoon villainy. The antagonists don't hiss melodramatically. They smile politely. They attend meetings. That restraint grounds the allegory in realism. Horror becomes recognizable. The film suggests the scariest monsters aren't theatrical. They're professional. This positions the movie within a broader evolution of horror in the 21st century. Post-2010 horror increasingly centers on societal anxieties, race, Get Out, class, Parasite though, not horror, immigration, His House, environmental collapse, The Host. The monster becomes a stand-in for systemic tension. Vampires vs. the Bronx participates in that movement, but recalibrates it for younger audiences. It asks a bold question. Can you introduce kids to structural critique without stripping away adventure? The answer, here, is yes, if you trust metaphor. What's especially notable is how the film avoids cynicism. Many socially conscious horror films end with ambiguity or lingering dread. Victory feels partial. Survival feels fragile. This story, by contrast, allows triumph. The block fights back and wins. That choice might seem simplistic to hardened genre fans, but it serves a purpose. Youth-oriented storytelling often functions aspirationally. It offers models of agency. The message isn't, systems are unbeatable, it's collective resistance matters. That optimism differentiates it from darker counterparts. Even visually, the film resists Gothic aesthetic cues. No endless fog. No candlelit chambers. Instead, the horror unfolds in bodegas and apartment complexes, in community centers, in everyday spaces. That normalization of settings strengthens metaphor. The threat doesn't invade fantasy worlds. It infiltrates daily life. There's also something subversive about reclaiming vampire lore, a genre historically dominated by European aristocratic imagery, and placing it in a predominantly Black and Latino urban community. The power dynamic flips. The traditional symbol of elite consumption becomes literalized within marginalized spaces. It's not just a monster movie, it's a reclamation, and that reclamation extends to tone. Horror comedy often diffuses political commentary by leaning too heavily into parody. This film walks a fine line. The jokes never mock the stakes. Humor comes from character interplay, not thematic undercutting. The vampires are funny only in their absurd entitlement, not in their threat level. That tonal discipline preserves metaphor integrity. If we trace vampire cinema chronologically from Nosferatu to Dracula, from Hammer horror to teen romance franchises, Vampires vs. the Bronx might not rank as stylistically groundbreaking, but thematically it contributes to the monster's cultural mutation. Monsters evolve because fears evolve, and right now one of the dominant fears isn't eternal damnation, it's erasure. Erasure of culture, of history. of local identity beneath polished redevelopment. The film captures that anxiety through accessible genre storytelling without succumbing to despair, which raises an even larger question: what does it mean to make politically resonant horror for families in a streaming era where attention spans are fractured and discourse is polarized? Because balancing accessibility with commentary might be the film's most delicate achievement yet, and that balancing act deserves its own deeper excavation. There's something inherently risky about making a politically resonant horror film for families. Lean too hard into commentary and it feels like a lecture. Soften the message too much and the metaphor loses teeth. Vampires versus teeth. The Bronx operates in that narrow corridor between education and entertainment, and its success lies in how carefully it calibrates that balance. The film never uses the word gentrification as a blunt instrument in long, didactic speeches. Instead, it dramatizes the effects. Storefronts close, rent rises, familiar faces disappear. For younger viewers, those changes register emotionally before they register intellectually. The horror isn't abstract policy, it's loss of routine, loss of corner stores, loss of space to exist freely. That experiential framing invites empathy without requiring economic vocabulary. This is where tone becomes everything. Family-friendly horror historically falls into two camps: sanitized adventure, Goosebumps, or heightened camp, Hocus Pocus. Rarely does it carry overt social allegory. Vampires vs. the Bronx threads something unusual. It introduces systemic critique while preserving playfulness. Garlic water balloons and DIY stakes keep energy buoyant. The humor reassures. But underneath, the commentary hums steadily. Streaming distribution amplifies this balancing act. In theaters, audiences self-select into R-rated social horror knowing they'll confront discomfort. On Netflix, the barrier is lower. A 13-year-old can stumble upon this film during Halloween scrolling. That accessibility demands tonal responsibility. The scares can't traumatize. The themes can't overwhelm. The film manages that by externalizing the threat completely. The villains are unmistakably monstrous. The metaphor remains digestible. What's fascinating is how the movie avoids partisan framing. It doesn't descend into policy debate. It personalizes change rather than politicizing it overtly. That strategic choice broadens audience reach. You don't have to align with a particular ideology to understand losing your home hurts. The film's politics operate through empathy rather than argument, and yet it's not apolitical. By centering Black and Latino youth as defenders of their community, the film quietly challenges Hollywood norms. Historically, marginalized characters in horror are often victims first, heroes later, if at all. Here, they're strategists, organizers, leaders. The narrative agency belongs to them from the start. That shift alone carries political weight without a single speech announcing it. There's also a crucial optimism embedded in the story's resolution. Many contemporary social horror films end ambiguously, reflecting real-world complexity. Vampires vs. the Bronx chooses victory. The community rallies. The invaders burn. On one level, that might feel tidy. But for younger audiences, hopeful endings aren't naive. They're empowering. They reinforce the idea that collective action can yield results. Hope, in this context, becomes radical. In an era when media often emphasizes systemic helplessness, presenting kids as capable of defending their environment offers counter-narrative energy. It says, "You're not powerless." That message lands differently depending on age. Adults might see metaphor. Kids see possibility. The film also understands pacing as a tool of accessibility. It doesn't linger excessively on despair. When tension builds too heavily, humor punctures it. When exposition risks slowing momentum, action accelerates. That rhythmic modulation keeps the tone buoyant without trivializing stakes. Even the violence reflects this balance. Vampire deaths are dramatic but not grotesque. Combustion over carnage, stylized rather than graphic. That choice maintains horror credibility while respecting audience range. It signals danger without trauma. There's a broader industry implication here too. Streaming platforms increasingly seek content that crosses demographic lines, family accessible but thematically layered. Vampires vs. the Bronx functions as a prototype for that model. Genre storytelling with social conscience, calibrated for wide accessibility. It proves you can introduce systemic commentary into youth narratives without alienating viewers. And perhaps most importantly, it trusts its audience. It trusts young viewers to sense injustice. It trusts adults to recognize metaphor. It trusts that fun and thoughtfulness aren't mutually exclusive. That trust elevates the film beyond disposable Halloween fare. But there's one more dimension worth examining: place. Because the Bronx in this film isn't just setting or symbol. It participates in a long cinematic history of urban representation. From gritty crime dramas to hip-hop documentaries, the borough has been framed through various lenses, often harsh, sometimes romanticized. How Vampires vs. the Bronx positions itself within that lineage reveals even more about its cultural footprint. And that broader historical context reshapes how we interpret its quiet legacy. The Bronx has lived many cinematic lives. In the 1970s and 80s, it was framed through decay-burning buildings, crime headlines, urban abandonment. Films like Fort Apache, The Bronx, painted it as battleground. In the 90s and early 2000s, hip-hop documentaries and coming-of-age dramas reclaimed it through music and grit, but often still filtered through struggle. Even when celebrated, it was usually portrayed as something to survive or escape. Vampires vs. the Bronx does something quietly radical. It doesn't treat the borough as tragedy. It treats it as treasure. From the opening frames, the camera lingers not on ruin, but on rhythm. Murals, storefronts, kids biking freely. The Bronx here isn't framed as broken, it's framed as vibrant. That shift matters in a long history of media narratives that have often reduced urban neighborhoods to hardship aesthetics. This film doesn't deny economic pressure, but it refuses to define the space by it. And that reframing connects directly to its central conflict. Because historically, redevelopment narratives often depict neighborhoods as improving through outside investment. The cinematic lens has sometimes mirrored that ideology, new buildings as symbols of progress. But in Vampires vs. the Bronx, sleek architecture signals threat. Glossy condos become horror imagery. Sterile interiors feel predatory. That inversion is powerful. It challenges the visual grammar audiences are used to. Clean lines don't equal safety. Wealth doesn't equal salvation. Sometimes polish masks erasure. By positioning the Bronx as already whole, already rich in culture, the film subverts the assumption that outside intervention equals advancement. There's also an intergenerational undercurrent here. The kids defend not just their present, but inherited memory, family businesses, local traditions, spaces that existed before them. That through line connects to real-world cultural preservation movements within borough communities. Cinema rarely frames that preservation as heroic. This film does. And because it does so through genre, it reaches audiences who might never watch a documentary about urban displacement. That's part of its quiet legacy. It smuggles representation into pop entertainment. It places Black and Latino teens at the center of a universal monster narrative and says, "This is your myth now," not as victims, as protagonists. When we talk about legacy in streaming-era cinema, it's rarely about box office dominance. It's about endurance within digital libraries. It's about becoming part of seasonal ritual. Vampires vs. the Central Ritual. The Bronx feels positioned for that kind of slow-burn legacy. Every October, when viewers search for something spooky but not traumatizing, it's there, waiting. And for a new generation discovering horror through streaming, this may be one of their first allegorical monster stories. That matters. Genre films often shape how young audiences understand metaphor. A kid who watches this at 12 may not articulate its commentary on gentrification immediately, but the emotional logic embeds itself. Community good, predatory replacement, bad. Collective action works. Those impressions linger. There's also industry impact to consider. Representation in genre is no longer novelty, but normalization is ongoing. Films like this contribute to that normalization. They don't announce diversity as marketing hook. They embed it naturally. That quiet confidence signals progress. Could it have been sharper? Absolutely. A more daring stylistic approach. A slightly edgier tonal commitment. Deeper villain complexity. Those elements might have elevated it from solid to seminal. But legacy isn't always about perfection. Sometimes it's about positioning. Positioning young marginalized voices as defenders of home. Positioning urban community as something worth protecting, not escaping. Positioning horror as a vehicle for empowerment rather than despair. Over time, its cultural footprint may resemble films like The Goonies, not revolutionary in form, but beloved for spirit. A comfort watch with teeth, a gateway into deeper conversations. And perhaps that's the final layer. Monsters in cinema reflect what we fear losing. In earlier eras, it was purity, morality, immortality. Today, for many communities, it's space, identity, belonging. Vampires versus the Bronx captures that fear without surrendering to it. The block stands, the lights stay on, the music keeps playing, and somewhere, a kid watching for the first time realizes horror stories don't have to center castles in faraway lands. They can center their street, their friends, their home. That shift alone ensures the film won't disappear quietly, because sometimes the most lasting legacy isn't about how loudly a film roars. It's about who finally gets to hold the stake. Legacy isn't just about what a film says. It's about what it makes possible afterward. When you step back and look at Vampires versus the Bronx in the broader streaming era landscape, it occupies an intriguing space. It's not a tentpole, not a franchise launcher, not a meme factory that dominated timelines for months. Instead, it feels like a foundational brick, quietly reinforcing a larger shift happening in genre storytelling. Streaming changed the rules. In theatrical cycles, mid-budget genre films often struggled. Too small for blockbuster marketing, too expensive for niche arthouse runs. Many either underperformed financially or were never greenlit at all. But platforms like Netflix created room for stories that didn't need to gross 100 million opening weekend to justify existence. They needed to find an audience, sustain engagement, live in the catalog. Vampires versus the Bronx benefits from that ecosystem. It's the kind of film that thrives on rediscovery, a teenager scrolling during Halloween season, a parent looking for horror that won't traumatize their kid, a teacher assigning socially conscious media for discussion. Each new viewer extends its lifespan. That's the new model of cultural endurance, slow accumulation rather than explosive debut. And here's what makes that important. Representation compounds. A kid who sees Miguel organizing his neighborhood may not consciously frame it as empowerment. But 5 years later, when another film centers marginalized youth in genre space, it won't feel groundbreaking. It'll feel normal. That normalization is legacy in action. Think about how rare it once was to see Black and Latino teens as central heroes in supernatural stories. Historically, genre films sidelined them, or worse, sacrificed them early for shock value. This film quietly flips that script without drawing attention to the flip. That absence of announcement is power. It says, this belongs here. It also subtly reshapes how we define horror victories. Many contemporary horror films conclude with survival at a cost. Trauma lingers. The world remains broken. That bleak realism reflects adult anxieties. But for younger audiences, stories of decisive communal triumph offer something different. They create rehearsal space for resistance, not denial of reality, but rehearsal for agency. And that distinction matters when thinking about long-term cultural impact. Because horror has always functioned as a training ground for fear. You confront the monster safely. You process anxiety symbolically. In this film, the monster isn't a random force of nature. It's structural, organized, systemic. Teaching young viewers to identify systemic threat, even metaphorically, isn't small. Will the film be cited in academic horror studies decades from now? Possibly not as a central pillar, but it may be referenced as part of a wave, a period when genre storytelling diversified both thematically and demographically, when allegory became accessible across age groups, when streaming allowed mid-scale social horror to flourish without box office constraints. There's also something to be said about tone longevity. Films drenched in cultural cynicism sometimes age quickly. They're tethered tightly to a moment. Vampires versus the Bronx, by contrast, anchors itself in enduring themes: home, friendship, belonging. Those themes don't expire. Economic pressure may evolve. Neighborhood demographics may shift. But the emotional stakes of defending identity remain constant. That universality gives it replay value. And then there's the simplest measure of legacy: memory. Will viewers remember specific shots? Maybe not vividly. Will they remember the feeling of kids fighting back together? Almost certainly. Cinema doesn't always endure through technical innovation. Sometimes it endures through emotional imprint. The final image of Community reclaimed isn't just narrative closure, it's ideological closure. The block survives. Culture persists. That image, for certain viewers, becomes aspirational mythology. In the end, Vampires versus the Bronx may not roar in film history textbooks, but it hums steadily in the background of streaming libraries, Halloween playlists, and youth genre discovery. It represents a moment when horror widened its lens, when monsters reflected economic anxiety and heroes looked like the neighborhoods often pushed to the margins. And that's no small thing, because every time a young viewer presses play and sees their street framed not as a problem but as something worth defending, the genre expands a little further. Sometimes legacy isn't about revolution. Sometimes it's about who finally gets to stand at the center of the frame. Stake in hand, sun rising, block intact.